Hi everyone and welcome back to another episode of Fight Chat Friday from TKD Coach Academy. This week we're going to look at how punching has changed over the last 10 to 20 years. So in particular we're looking at, has there been changes in the style, what's been effective, the level of contact, the time in contact, and a few other factors. So if you want to see how change has affected punching over the last years, stay with us for this episode.
Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of Fight Chat Friday. So in this episode, as Adrian mentioned, we're going to look at things such as the trajectory of punches, how that has changed, if it has changed, how body contact influences that, transitions in contact. So maybe you start off at a longer range and you got to adjust the punching to fit, essentially. And that time that we're going to have in contact as well. So is it a quick engagement, a bit longer, and of course the range, and how all these things affect the punching and the punching style that we're going to see in ITF Sparring.
Yeah, and I think as a jumping off point, one of the, two of them quite linked together. Like the time in contact and the transitions in contact are really strongly linked, because if we don't have much time in contact, we don't end up with these transitions in the same way. We transition in or out, but we don't use transitions to maintain the flow of punches in contact. So maybe let's jump into the time in contact and have a look at how that's evolved or changed over the years.
So what we're really talking about here is basically how many punches are in contact. Is it just a single punch like we might see here from Lindsay, where it's just a single punch? Or are we looking at maybe 3 to 4 punches in an exchange? So that's essentially the topic that we're looking at here and how that differs.
Yeah, and a couple of things kind of determine that, don't they? So, I mean, if people, by default re-engage with hands, so when the threat is presented, is the default position to come back with hands, or is it to concede ground? And, one of the things that really does affect that is obviously the nature of the competitor and what they themselves prefer, but the intervention of the referee matters in this as well. So, there's certainly been a tendency to stop engagements when the hands start to trade. So that's something that's been a little bit different and has forced competitors, I think, to like this, step in, step out and look for that break.
Yeah, and like that last clip there from Ian O'Hare and Magomed, both of those guys have a little bit of experience in wacko kickboxing, light contact as well, where that flow is just a little bit more continuous with hands. So I think that does help, because it allows you to work on that time in contact and, like we mentioned, work through the transitions to find the correct punches. Yeah,
for sure. And we have so I don't want to go back as far as that one, but we have some slight different things here. We look at Joanna Proprotska in a team sparring match here, and the ability to stay in contact without interruption is quite extreme, and this is a very extreme clip of it, where we have Zach Espy and Daniel Jawa, and the movement that develops and the kicks and the combinations that develop out of it. I think you'd probably have the match stopped here, and then because Daniel's able to slip out and re-engage, bring the hands to bear and come back in with the back kicks, you've got some absolutely astounding sequences of work that have built up there. And we just it's not a critique of the modern fighter. What it is it's saying, if the change in style or the change in the rules is encouraging a brief interaction, 1 to 2 punches and break, that kind of thing, well, then these kind of developments can't really come about. You can't spend the time in there to work that head movement to slip out and back in, because the referees will have to step in, and call a halt to things. So, I was only going to say, on my overall take in it, I do think there was more time in contact traditionally, going back 10-15 years ago, compared to now. I think now athletes are preparing to play the referee and play the rules, to get in, and if the momentum hasn't been built, to exit and re-enter. So I think it's more about enter, exit, rather than enter, develop, within and fight on the inside. I don't think the fighting on the inside is a thing anymore.
Yeah, because I think it's that initial contact, usually that first punch, like we seen the very first clip with Lindsay, it's looking for that clear shot, and usually that's the difference. Whereas before, you see like Daniel here, for example, was using a lot of head movement and slipping, and that's kind of something that we don't see as often. So maybe that's a factor as well, the fact that our stances now are much more bladed and side facing. It's a bit more difficult to engage in that head movement, bobbing and weaving. So maybe that's also a factor.
And I suppose because you enter from that side facing kind of position, when it comes to hands, you're either in a good position or you're in a bad position. And if you're in a bad position, you're back facing right away, and all of a sudden the referee is stepping in to protect you as a competitor. Whereas if you were coming in more in the half facing or full facing kind of fashion, you're in a better position to engage and trade hands. So maybe there's also that element of it as we look at it, that because people are entering from a more side facing position, some more of the time they're going to enter into contact in a bad position.
True, yeah. That actually could be a good point, because I think that's actually the case, that usually it's one side is a little bit overwhelmed and it's a little bit messy, and then that's where the stop happens.
Well, let's have a look at some of the transitions that can emerge now and in the past, depending on the time that you've had in there. So what we're looking at here is, I suppose, really linking hands to feet, feet to hands, or the entry-exit kind of thing. Oops. I'll leave the sound down on that.
Yeah, we even see as well the transitions from types of punches. So you see that the first initial shot in these first 3 clips is often a very long one. And then as they get closer to contact, there's much shorter, tidier punches on the inside, often like short hooks and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the blitz isn't, unique to the modern era. There was proto blitzes and variations of the blitz going back, 10, 20 years ago. But that transition from the stance that leads into the to the blitz to what you're going to have on an inside sparring stance is a little bit different. And here we can see, and I think one of the big features of the fighters of just the very last generation was working the turning kick into pretty much every combination with hands, in order to make sure that there was the ability to link and get back into the hands again. So anytime any space developed, the turning kick is in there and then it's back into the hands again. So I think less looking for the exit.
Definitely. And I think, like, the thing is as well, is it's that initial very long clear punch which is the one that's often scored. Like these ones here on the inside, the short ones, at least in ITF scoring, it's very rare for that to actually be a scoring technique, because usually they just kind of cancel each other out, and they're not as clear and visible for referees. So it's usually, that's probably the reason why people are more favored towards that initial entry shot, the nice long one. But then it's interesting as well, because it's on the flip side, on the exit, looking for that long clear turning kick, for example, is very obvious and very visible. So I think that's what the key is here, really.
And I think the other element that kind of goes into that with the transitions and so on is the scoreboard. So when you see that you're not getting the reward for staying in there and trading and taking the contact on the head, well, maybe you don't, so it's like, if you're getting the reward on it, and that engagement was leading to you getting a 3 points to 1 advantage coming out of the engagement, you're going, well, I might just get stuck into a few more of these and come out, well up there. Whereas if you do all of that, you come out, you look at the scoreboard, and it's like nothing. It's like, well, I just got punched in the head 5 or 6 times there, or I took the risk, or as we know ourselves from being in the match, it's the Velcro passing by the face, and the scuffs and things like that. It's not so nice. But that side of things, if you're not seeing the reward on the scoreboard shapes what you're going to see in the ring. So there's an element of, if I'm not getting the return on that, then maybe I won't do it. But at the same time, in what we're coaching, it's like, you want to be bringing in that higher value turning kick or back kick or something to really work the scoreboard, so that if the hands are neutral and you're getting as much as your opponent, well, the kick is the separator, and that might leave you getting that 3-1 out of the exchange.
But that's what the point is as well, the separator, because if you're getting those shots on the inside and you're not reacting and you're not firing back, then the person will be rewarded on the scoreboard. So you can't just take those short inside punches and not react and just take them, because then there will be a visible difference, and then there will be a visible impact on the scoreboard as a result. So you need to almost just match that inside exchange and then be able to find that kick as well. So it's getting the extra bit is the key.
So on to a topic that's, I don't think is as clear cut, which is the preferred engagement range, for coming to hands. Now, I want to kind of put my hands up and say, look, before we went looking at the fights, I think I defaulted to the idea that the engagement range is going to be longer at the entry point now to where it was before. But I don't think it's always the case at all. Like I was finding as much either way. But certainly something to have a look at a few examples, and let's see what. Or let me make sure I've got this one right. It looks like I've got the wrong video dropped in there, but give me a second, I will find it because we do have that. I'll let that cycle over there for a second. So
like this particular clip here, like the competitor that was in blue, their engagement range was set for a kicking distance, which means that their body position is then actually incorrect, like we mentioned earlier. So when you're set up for kicking range, especially front leg side kick in particular, like the competitor here in blue, then you can't use your backhand, and you're in big trouble when it gets to hands, and you can see like you're off balance. The other person has a big advantage getting an angle, so that's a massive thing. Here we have Jenny in blue, and one thing that I want to highlight for Jenny as well is when she makes that initial contact from the further out range, but then when she gets closer, there's lots of punches. There's maybe 4 or 5 punches coming in with maybe 1 or 2 steps. So she's engaging. There's only 1 or 2 steps on the inside, but there's double that amount of punches. And I think that's a big thing that we mentioned earlier, getting that like visible advantage for the referees. So it was clear that there was lots of punches with maybe not as much return. Whereas Mira here, the girl in blue, she was firing back also, but it was just that range for Mira was much shorter. So the visibility of those punches isn't as clear for the referees. So I think that's why starting just that little bit further out is actually an advantage on the scoreboard. Like
with Robert here in the next clip, you can kind of see the range that he's got, and it does leave the punches very clear, and he's getting the insurance shot at the end.
Yeah, here we have another example where it's just a little bit scrappy again because it's so close, where you have that initial range was probably incorrect. And then there wasn't a reaction, where here Bartos is coming in, big long arm, like almost a joust, and then he gets the contact on the inside. We'll
grab that one again, because like that first one is so clear, like the length of the reach on that first shot just makes it abundantly clear for the umpires.
Yeah, and see, like, of course he's a nice height advantage as well, but that's really kicking range, isn't it? Is that what you kind of were thinking as well, Adrian, that most of the shots come from this range?
Yeah, you see, what I was expecting, we looked at the old ones and be like this one between Hong and Grega, and the where it seems like they can actually just step the front foot forward, and they're in hands range. You know, so the match is developing to a closer range, but then you kind of have, you know, the classical Polish movement style of the 2000s up to, you know, very recently, where there's so much more pulling, and because of the pulling, the range actually starts quite long, and it's only when the person makes a mistake and overextends that the range is being shortened. You know, but there's certainly examples of people starting from longer. You know, and here we have with Fatih against Zach, starting at really quite a longer range. You have that like Superman version of the punch, or even here with the backhand to the body. You know, you've got, you know, there's quite a bit of range on that.
Definitely.
And we would definitely say that's coming from that same range as we blitz at, I would say, you know, in the more kind of more recent times. But like, I definitely think that that underlying principle of, if you can hit with the arm fully extended, it's going to be a much clearer score, particularly to the head. If you're the one that goes first, it's a clearer score, and that still applies, you know, no matter what generation it is, because the scoring criteria for the point hasn't changed. You know, we still want to see the attacking tool on the target extended with some control. We want to see a retraction. We want to see eyes on target. So all those kind of things are still elements of the scoring principle. So it makes sense that you know, the effectiveness of the score hasn't changed that way. But, you know, it really does seem like I did start from the premise that like as I remembered it, shall we say, or as I remember watching the videos, it was generally, I kind of thought that, look, the sparring happens at, or the contact with the hands happens at closer. But I think all that is just remembering the time spent in contact. So there's more trades in a standing, half facing, full facing kind of exchange, rather than the distance that we might have now, or even if we're stepping in now, it's a single or maybe a couple of shots at a particular range, maybe a single shot that carries you into range, and then there's a very brief exchange and out again. It's so rare that the exchange carries through.
I think there's a link there between what we've seen earlier and this particular one, because that maybe mindset of looking to get those extra punches in contact, so that time in contact that we highlighted earlier, I think that's kind of a mindset that actually adjusts the distance as well. Because, for example, Joanna, as an example from the clips we used, she is looking to continue through that contact and spend time in that contact with hands.
Yeah.
I think that actually impacts the range then that they set off at and they start from. Whereas some people, kind of like we mentioned earlier, they're looking for that initial clear shot at that further out distance.
Yeah.
So I think maybe the mindset is just a little bit different as well. But then we see like people with a hybrid of both, like Fatty, for example, starts at that longer range, maybe because he wasn't extremely tall in that heavyweight division. And then he was able to close that distance and continue on while having momentum. Obviously a really big guy, so it's kind of about using your strengths as well, I think, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. I mean, you always have to play to it. I mean, if you go to Poprotska, she didn't have sidekick, didn't use sidekick, but she would use downward kick, turning kick, front push kick, and so on, and a huge range of pulling movements to adjust and change the distance. But when she got to hands, she picked really good scoring shots with the legs from that position. So yeah, great.
Those full facing shots that you mentioned there.
Yeah, very much so. And I mean, it comes down to her saying, well, this is the stance that I did, that I fight in. And she did a lot of cross training, so she did quite a bit of, like, I don't want to say for sure it was K1 style, but she certainly did a lot of kickboxing, and in the ring with ropes rather than tatami sport.
Yeah.
And and then so she was fighting in a style that was kind of more suited to both. So that made sense, in a lot of ways for her. Now I know Taekwondo was her primary thing. I don't think she ever really competed. She trained in it, but I don't think she ever competed in kickboxing. But I stand to be corrected on that one. But certainly, when you look at how she was moving, it's not what we would expect. Most people now will at least start in that side-facing stance, or mostly side-facing stance, and respect the sidekick game. Even if they transition, they would probably respect the sidekick game and use it to some degree. There's very few now that just go, you know what, I don't need a sidekick.
Do you think that now the range, the clips we've seen there today are kind of like from the early 2000s, kind of
typically,
into the
yeah,
10 area, and then the more current area? Do you think that back then the distance was a little bit closer in general, the initial distance that we engage at, maybe?
Yeah, I think so. I think what you had was there was a game that was played almost outside of range, where there was feinting and change of stance and movement in and out and pulling. That was at I just don't think you have now. You don't have that super long range pre-game, I think, anymore. And then what would happen is someone would end up making a mistake in that pre-game and would end up closer to the edge of the ring, and then the pressure would build and the game would happen in a closer space. That's you can see that repeated in for certain fighters, and some were very happy with that. They could just concede the pre-game and go, come on back here to the edge of the ring, I'm happy here. And Jawa would be a really good example of that. But I think the step to hands, because you didn't have as explosive a carry off the front leg, there was very, very few people. I mean, we picked out Neil Ernest there a while ago, who could be very explosive off his front leg with sidekick. Thomas Brad is another clear example going back there. But there was an awful lot of people where you just didn't have an explosive carrying front leg. And so because that, you didn't have to respect the explosive carrying front leg, you could stand in a little closer and then just drift back a small bit off the sidekick, and that was enough to get you away. Whereas if you're stepping into the ring now against an Alamina Vitali, a Luke Moriarty, whoever it happens to be, you have to respect the distance that they can cover off that front leg. So if you're close, you have to step in on it. Otherwise, you might go to that longer range and push, pull, get them to pick up the leg and attack a dropping leg. There's just micro differences in I think in the way that it's played. But I do think go for it.
I was actually going to say that I think that the scoreboard is actually a big factor of that for the more side facing, because naturally athletes will kind of come up with the best solutions for the game. And I think that maybe earlier in the clips that we've seen that were the older ones, there was more of like a fight mentality, and it was like you gotta outfight the other person and beat them. Where I think now people are just a bit more clever in terms of the game state, where it's more like sport orientated, and as a result, people are seeing more return from the front leg side kick, for example, as opposed to, like we mentioned, those in close range hands that don't get rewarded as often.
Yeah, I think you see a little less broken play. Like, I think previously, the front leg could be broken down a little bit more. People were willing to engage and try and counter it, bringing themselves into contact with the hands. Moving to the open side for an angle turning kick or something like that nowadays is considered quite risky, because you're bringing yourself onto hands. But at that point, it's like, sure, I'm bringing myself onto hands, but on my terms, so I'm fine with it. Where it just, maybe it's not the clearest scoring option now, and in a kind of a more scoreboard oriented or points oriented kind of style of thinking, you might want to have the clearer or more definite score. So you might spoil that side kick or drift out and attack back with one of your own, or you end up with that front leg fencing kind of environment. So yeah, I think another factor at play there for sure.
Yeah. So what do we have left to cover?
Let's have a little look at the trajectory. So there was a few things in this, and I want to at least pay some respect to the idea of, and I didn't go all the way back to when jumping punches were at their height, so the mid 2000s and so on. But the idea of getting a bit of verticality on the punches was one of the factors in trajectory. But we have some other bits to talk about, I think, as well, from the more recent kind of era, and it really is where are people taking their punches from, and and the why of it.
Yeah, this is actually the kind of the motivation for this video. Actually, is this small topic, and you see Alamin here. He kind of initiates with a bit of a back fist, and it gives him a nice angle as well to avoid the side kick. Here you have a competitor from Norway in the next clip. Then,
yeah, we'll just have a look at that Alamin one once again.
Yeah, the angle of the back fist that he gets here it puts him off the line of the side kick. And then here is Norway in red. You can see it's very, very direct, and it's like the elbows are quite high. And what I was thinking myself is, because as Taekwondo students we learn how to punch, like for example parallel punch is one of the first things you learn how to do for technical Taekwondo, and we bring it back to the hip. And I noticed that some people, they punch and their arms kind of fall towards their chest, where some people in their sparring, they keep their hands kind of above that shoulder level, and they're able to kind of push forward. So it's an interesting little contrast. Now both of them work in different scenarios, and even this one here, Colm starts really, really low, but he brings it up, and then the second punch, once it gets up, is very direct forward. So he has a bit of a mix there as well, and I guess it depends on the distance. But here Thomas is going very, very high with the arms. So it's just like, it's an interesting contrast to see just the visibility of it again for the referees and the scoreboard.
Yeah, and I mean, the few things that jump to mind straight away is obviously most of us don't carry a boxing style guard. We don't carry high hands and tight elbows, and it mainly, of course, because we're dealing with kicks to the body and so on as well. So we'll tend to protect against the kicks to the body while using the head movement, the body movement, and distance to protect the head more so. And then you'd expect the hands to transition up as we close the distance. But it does lead to some interesting trajectories, as you say, coming from the hip up, which, will change, I suppose, as well, how you defend the punches. But whether it's, linked back to some of the more traditional stuff, I don't know. But it's certainly something that, is a feature of it. This is just Alice. So we just can see here straight away that bit of vertical, which we wouldn't have that little skip or the Superman style thing as frequently anymore. But it was something that was very, very effective for quite a while. So any thoughts as to why we don't see that anymore?
Yeah, I think that just now it's that jump into distance. People are just that sharper off the front leg. Because even here, Ronnie in blue, great side kick. One of actually the best I've ever seen ever. But you can see that he was almost waiting for a counter off the back leg.
Yeah.
Which probably isn't like the best counter for that direct jump forward. So yeah, maybe that's it. People are just keeping that front leg just a little bit lighter and a little bit sharper. And able to, like even here you can see Daniel is very much putting the weight on over his back leg here in blue, and on the left against Arto he's very much leaning back. So I think that is a big factor as well in terms of your weight placement, of where you can adjust a little bit quicker to get to the hands. Yeah,
and it does mean then, like, the backhand that's coming from the hip is taking very often that either like almost traditional, Yakuzuki karate style, hand from the hip to the face kind of thing, or we have the body lean that goes with it that then brings the turning kick. But the trajectory is quite different, depending on the initial body position. and we see quite a few here. And this last one with Joanna Proprotska against Hosnia Karim, I just want to bring in because of the, defensively taking that jump against, a rush with hands was definitely a more common solution rather than what we tend to expect now is more of a slip or a bump, in terms of the body position. And it was just a different way of, right, let's just take the line of the attacking punches off of the line of where our body is at the moment and see where that takes us. And, it was effective in minimizing the number of scores that the person was getting.
Yeah, but I think all these things kind of interlink because you see, again, Kareem there was coming through and she was getting multiple... Are we on silent? Are we all right there, yeah?
You're grand.
Thought I lost you. So, yeah, I think that as they were carrying through, she was maybe not doing the traditional blitz, more like the sprint blitz that we call it.
Sure, yeah.
Whereas we've seen the one now from Colin Carroll, for example, is just that bit more extension. So I think that it's harder to use that jumping punch on the defense. But I think, don't get me wrong, both of these styles of punching work, but it's just that more direct style versus the one that kind of travels up as it goes forward. And I think that at that longer distance, the one that travels up is actually a little bit better because visually it's out of sight and it kind of comes up and to your face quite quickly. But then once you get that initial entry, I think keeping the hands high above the shoulder line is probably the best way. But again, you can see people who adapt that and they kind of loop their punches. So it kind of it's just trying to figure out what works for your style and how you can maximize punches for you. But it is an interesting little contrast that there's different styles there for sure, that people kind of loop their punches up and down vertically, and then people who kind of go very much like horizontally forward as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things that kind of underpins that as a principle is, well, you don't want to have it so that your hands are a giveaway for your next technique. So I mean, if your hands come up before you go forward to punch, it's kind of a giveaway. So if you carry your hands low, generally, and you kick from there as well, then starting from there with punches kind of takes away some of the information from your opponent. There's an advantage to that. Whereas carrying your hands high all of the time, may not be the very best thing for some of your, defensive stuff, and you can't interact with the front. Like if your hand is up here, you can't really interact with the leg that's in front of you, and that gives you a disadvantage defensively. So we work in a very transitional game between the ranges of extreme long range, and so on all the way in. So understanding how the hands will move, between all of those ranges as you try to engage hands is probably pretty important. And it brings us into one last topic, which is the body contact, which, particularly starting to the body, we still see a defensive backhand to the body every now and again, but starting to the body has become kind of a rare thing with just a few exceptions. And I probably should have thrown Alamin's clip in there because he's a great, backhand blitz to the body. But we do have just a few of them from slightly more, slightly further into the mists of time. All of 8 or 10 years ago.
It was interesting because Adrian was kind of covering the older clips for this video, and I was covering the more new school, as we call it, clips, and I didn't really find many with entries to the body. So Adrian found a couple, and it was interesting that people actually use that as an entry shot. But I think that generally now maybe it's kind of more favoured towards the higher weights. Maybe now you will see, of course, there's always somebody who will come up with that difference as well of starting at a lighter weight, of course, but I think it's more of something that was featured more in the heavier weights. What do you think? Yeah,
that's very, very possible. I mean, Neil is the lightest of the guys that I found favouring this shot, in the videos that I was looking at, and he tends to, it starts as a kind of a counter shot, but sometimes he just steps into it, and a big feature in where he's doing it and where he likes it is, he's sparring left-legged and he's sparring a lot of right-legged guys, and he's stepping to their blind side as he steps in with that backhand to the body, and it kind of fully commits him. So once he's in there, they're often in a poor position because his body is now so close, the backhand is in, and he does that. We spoke about it when we were chatting with Neil, that right and right again, they almost like the double backhand, where as long as he's got the first one in, he's able to then follow up to the head. So the first one sinks into the body and the second one then goes to the head. It's a very slightly different feature. It's not something that we're seeing much now. But the idea of using the attack to the body as an entry point is definitely something that I don't see very much. And even with Alameen, it's very much a case of the backhand to the body is really covering the back fist to the head. So he's using that stretch to kind of cover the front leg that might be rising from the opponent, and then the back fist is what actually lands most of the time. But you know, it's just a nice contrast. And I think one of the big things that we'll find as we go through this is, over time, things will evolve very slightly. You'll start to see that pulling movement come back in to counter a dominating front leg side kick, as it did, you know, 15 or 18 years ago. Because if the game goes to everybody uses side kick against side kick, someone will go, I don't like side kick, let's do something else. And they'll find a way where they have an advantage knowing that everyone else isn't fighting against their game plan every day of the week. But they're fighting against everyone else's game plan every day of the week. So they're more practiced against front leg fencing side kick than the front leg fencer is practiced against the rabbit, who's, you know, pulling them right and left and seeking angles. So even if on paper it's slightly less efficient, it doesn't matter because they're more practiced in it than the person that they're facing. It's like fighting against left-legged fighters. If you're left-legged, you probably spend 3/4 of your time sparring against right-legged fighters, and then in the reverse, you're probably only spending 20 or 25% of your time fighting left-legged fighters. So left-legged fighters, I think, have a slight advantage going, you know, up the experiential grades, we'll say. So, you know, at the higher the level, the more likely you are to see a left-legged fighter. If you look at the lowest level in the tournaments, it's probably 4 or 5 right-leggers to 1 left. If you go into your club, the same. You go to the very top level, it's almost every second fighter is left-legged. You know, it's almost as if they're 50-50, which they're not. So yeah, I think that's an interesting thing with the punches as well. And I think as people need to counter the current styles, I think that's going to be very, very big. So I think that's going to be a huge thing in terms of us being able to advise our students for the future. Is don't look at only what's there now, look at what's there now and think about, well, what would be effective against that.
Yeah, and that's exactly where the motivation for this came from. I was trying to figure out what is the best kind of punching style to help with your students, because you see the blitz, and that's okay at the further out range, but it's what happens after that, and we've seen lots of good examples today. So I'm glad that we were able to do a little research and kind of use this as a way to come up with some clips of the higher level guys who were able to get those effective punches off once they get through that further out range. So yeah, I think the trajectory, the foot position, the time and contact, all that stuff is very much a play, but are interlinked. I think that's the key. I don't think it's any one thing that makes the difference. So you got to move your feet quick. You got to have punches and bunches and all that stuff. So I think you got to have all that stuff interlinked to get the best bang for your buck in terms of the punching. I think that's the big takeaway for me here.
And so I suppose if anyone has any thoughts on this, if they have ideas for what the next not fashion, but the next move in the meta game of ITF Sparring is going to be, if they have thoughts about why particular things were effective at particular times, the comments is absolutely the place for that, and we will definitely engage with people once the comments start coming in. So hopefully you've enjoyed this week's episode, and we'll have another topic for you, of course, next Friday. We're threatening a return to some of the more traditional sparring match analysis. So if there's a particular fight that people maybe want us to take a look at from any era, as long as we can find it, we'd be delighted to have a look over that and offer our thoughts and comments.
Yeah,
see you next week.
If you enjoyed it and you made it this far, make sure and hit that video a like. And as Adrian said, we'll see you next week.